Today I'm incredibly honored to have as our guest Frank Ostaseski. Frank is the co-founder of the Zen Hospice Project, the founder of the Metta Institute, an internationally beloved teacher, and author of the book, The Five Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. And I am so excited to have you here. Welcome, Frank. Thank you for coming and being a part of this tonight.
David, I'm glad to be with you. I hope we can be of some small service to the viewers.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. And I just want to take a minute before we start to make sure I get a chance to do this. I want to thank you personally for the five invitations. I've read many hundreds of books over the years, and the five invitations is definitely in my top 10, if not in my top 5. It's filled with profound wisdom, and it's one of those once-a-year books. So, thank you. Yeah.
Very kind.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We should give all the credit to the patients that I sat bedside with. Everything in the book comes from them.
I know that's the truth. So listen, we're going to talk about grief tonight. We're also going to try to get to talking about the five invitations, but I suspect we could regale each other for many hours. We won't do that. But if you have a question and you want to just throw it up in the comment section, if we get an opportunity tonight, we'll do some Q&A with Frank as we move along here as well. So maybe put a Q in front of your comment. I'll know it's a question, and we can take it as we approach the end. So let me start with this, Frank. At the Zen Hospice Project, when you were there, you guys had a simple way of describing the process of grieving as loss, losing, and loosening. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure, David. And I want to just say at the outset, though, that I'm suspicious of any maps. There are lots of models out there about grief. And so this isn't so much of a model as much as it is something we've witnessed in the lives of the people that we took care of. So loss is that first period of grief where it's visceral. You feel like you've been punched in the belly. All your breath is taken away. Even when death is expected, somehow our minds can't really wrap themselves around the reality of the loss. We don't want to believe that the person we love died. So it has this incredible feeling of, it's visceral. And it takes us by surprise. And it usually includes things like shock and disbelief and these kinds of states of mind. I remember once a woman in the hospice died, and her sister was a loving presence in her life. And her sister was down the hall when her beloved sister died. Linda died. And when Karen came back into the room, I said, Linda's died, and we have this process of bathing the body. Would you like to join in that? And Karen said, no, she's not dead yet. Now, it was obvious that Linda had stopped breathing. She had died. But I believe people. So I said, well, when was she most alive? And she said, when she was a youngster, she was a troublemaker. And then she was a teenager, and she was a real adventurer. She was a spelunker, went into caves. And then later she became an editor for a magazine, a progressive magazine. And she went on to tell me basically all the important things of Linda's life. And then she said, remember last week, Frank, she fell and she broke her arm and you carried her back into bed? And I said, yes, I remember. And she said, then I was just down the hall. And then it came to her that Linda had died. But she was lagging a little bit. And that's often the case with this first step of loss, or this first phase of loss. We lag a little bit. We're not quite there yet. And so we need to give people the time that they need to adjust to that. And, for a lot of people, there's this regret, like, I should have brought him to the hospital earlier, or I should have done more. And, I always kind of wonder, what would it be like if just for a moment we listened to the sound of our own voice and see the criticality that's in some of those statements? And I'm sure that if we listened carefully, our heart would embrace our own pain. So loss is this visceral experience. Then there's this experience of losing. And when someone we love dies, we don't just lose them once, we lose them many times. If your wife was the one who kept the bed warm at night, when you get into bed and feel the cold sheets, you lose her again. If she was the one who went to the bank and did the banking business, whenever you go to the bank, you lose her again. So there's this period that goes on for a long time, it can go on for a year or two of continuous losing. And this is the time when we often feel most alone, and when our friends are tired of the story of our loss and they want us to move on, So there's this long period of losing. And then there's this period we call loosening, and it's when the intensity of grief loses its stranglehold on us, We have this expression that time heals, but that's kind of a half-truth. Time alone doesn't heal. Time and loving attention heal. So there does come a period, if we have been giving our loving attention to ourselves and embracing the various phases of grief, that it loses its strength. Its fingers come away from our throat, and we can breathe again. And we start, for a while, we start realizing that we don't have that same external relationship with the person, but we're developing an internal relationship with them. And then they can come and go with us everywhere, So think about this grieving process as a way of developing a different sort of relationship with the person we loved. And to think about grief not just as an enormous sadness, but as having many different faces. And among them are fear and numbness and anger and regret and all manner of things. But what's most important, David, in conclusion around this, is that what grief is the way that we love the person who's died. Grief is often, I say sometimes, grief is a love that has no place to go.
Yes.
Yeah. So, loss, losing, and loosening. And they're not linear, of course. These are states of mind and heart that explode onto the surface of our awareness. Yeah.
Wow. So, I was fascinated by this thought that you said, I was reading, in managing the grief of others and ourselves, we are generally afraid and impatient. Our own unexplored fear of grief can lead us to hurry others along the path of healing. Can you say a little bit more about that unexplored fear of grief?
Sure. In our culture, as you know better than most, we have some hesitation around experiencing our own grief and also being willing to speak to others about their grief. It's like a friend of mine whose husband was named Romeo, and he died suddenly. And she was an Asian American woman, and she didn't know what to do with this, so she went to work and she was crying at her desk every day. And the people in her office said, "You should go see the people at Human Resources." And she went down, saw the person at Human Resources, and he said to her, "Well, you seem to be taking this very difficult. You need some therapy." And in her culture, that meant she was crazy. And so she went home and she drew the curtains and she stayed at home for months. Didn't go out at all, until a friend of hers said, "Look, I know this guy Frank Ostaseski, and he's doing a workshop on grief. Maybe you should come with me." And she came, and what she told me was that everyone wanted her to move on. They kept saying, "Get a dog." Her husband, her most beloved person in the world, had died, and she wanted. Her friends said, "Get a dog," or "Take up dancing." They wanted to rush her along because they were uncomfortable with her grief. And it's not just peer-to-peer, it can happen with professionals too. In our bereavement groups across the country, some of them are extraordinarily helpful. But sometimes they have a limited range about what's allowed in that group. For example, we need to allow for the wildest expressions of grief, our rage and anger. These are faces of grief. Or for numbness, the feeling like we're walking through molasses. Both of those are expressions of grief, manifestations of grief. So if we're not familiar with those in our own lives, we may want to shut them down in the lives of others. Whereas if we've explored them ourselves, then we can build an empathetic bridge from our experience to theirs, and we can become a trustworthy refuge for them.
Yes. Yeah, that's an amazing phrase, becoming a trustworthy refuge. Um, we were talking before about when you and I were going back and forth. We were talking about accessing the feelings of grief and how sometimes it's just people get in a place where they have never been given permission to grieve, never been given vocabulary around grief, and then they're put into a grieving situation and they can't access that emotion. And you were talking about some of the experiences you've had around that. Tell us about the plate experience that you had.
Well, I was working with a group of mostly women who had all had a diagnosis of terminal cancer, and it's kind of like what you're describing. People kept talking to them about getting in touch with their grief, and their friends expected them to be sorrowful, and these women didn't feel sadness so much. And it was really clear to me as we were working that wasn't where they needed to go. So I went into the kitchen and I got a big stack of plates. And I went outside and I gave all these women a stack of plates. And they took the plates and they started throwing them at a cement wall and smashing the plates. Now something started to happen. Now they were in touch with something real. And what it was their anger. They were furious about their life being cut short. And, our tendency is to say, well, let's get to the sadness that's under that anger. No. Let's deal with the anger.
Yes.
The anger is here. Anger is an equally viable expression of that grief. And let's not turn away from it. Let's include it and see what it has to show us. Anger, for example, has a lot of strength in it, has a lot of energy in it that we need to go through the process of loss. So let's find out about it. Let's get familiar with it. Let's sit down with it and have a cup of tea, get to know it really well. So lots of faces of grief. Think of it as a constellation of experiences. There's sadness, of course, but there's also fear, there's confusion, there's anger, there's remorse, there's numbness, there's all manner of expressions. And we have to make room for all of them.
Yes.
No one way to grieve and no one way through the process.
Yes. You talk about how we never say that we need to manage our joy, or we never say that we need to get over our happiness, but we often use those ways of speaking about grief. And then you went on to say grief is like a stream running through our lives, and it's important to understand that loss doesn't go away. It lasts a lifetime. It's our relationship to a particular loss that changes.
Yeah, I think so. Look, we're talking about a subject here that we can't deal with just conceptually, David. Grief is an experience of the body and heart. And it's got its own time frame, and it's got its own rhythm, and it's got its own, own particular energy, and it can't be rushed. It's a process of the soul. It's not just a psychological experience. So, and it's our common ground. It's a kind of underground river running through all our lives. Sometimes our grief is about what we've had and lost, for example, a relationship, but sometimes it's about what we didn't get to have. A dream that didn't get lived through, or a relationship that didn't develop. So, yes, it is an experience it's a physical experience, grief. It's a really physical experience that has emotional expression. But, we're busy trying to keep everything in order. We're so busy trying to keep everything normal. And grief is a normal experience, but we express it very differently. So let's not try and manage other people's grief. Let's be with them through the various expressions of their grief. For example, let me ask you, David, if I may, put you on the spot here, but do you know what it's like when you're afraid? What happens in your body when you're afraid? What do you notice about your physical body when you're afraid?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think I feel constriction, maybe sweaty palms. You can feel muscles tightening, and the desire to flee, that whole flight fight thing, and so it's very visceral.
What happens in your mind when you're afraid? What do you notice?
Scrambled.
Kind of scrambled or strategic. You start thinking about how you're going to get out of the fear,
Yes.
the difficult situation. Yeah, beautiful. So you actually know a lot about this. So here's the thing I want to point out, and it's true of fear and it's true of grief, that the part of you that's aware of your grief or that's aware of your fear is not afraid, and it's not grief. And that's a place you can function from. And it's not esoteric and it's not California woo-woo stuff. It's here. You're cognizant of your fear. You're cognizant of your grief. And you can function from that or you can function from the fear. You have a choice. If there's no awareness of the grief or no awareness of the fear, you don't have choice. You're stuck. You're a victim to it. But if we become aware, oh, this is what I'm feeling, this is how it's expressing itself in the body, this is what happens in my mind, then we have choice. Then, and the experience which first feels like fragmentation, which is what grief feels like you've been split into 1,000 pieces, this then can become a path to wholeness. And if we walk that path with some degree of love and integrity, that's how we come to healing.
Yes.
It's not by trying to get over it or push through it or managing the experience. It's by metabolizing it. It's by integrating it, by including grief in our life, and then seeing how it informs all the rest of our actions.
Wow. One of the quotes from the book was, most often we think of grief as an overwhelming response to a singular event, usually the death of someone we love. Yet when we look more closely, we see that grief has been our companion for a good part of our life. So there is, as you said, this stream of grief that often goes unrecognized, and so it doesn't inform our life, and it doesn't,
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes it's a stream, and sometimes it's a raging river. I mean, it's just powerful. It can completely take over our lives. I mean, you know as well as I that sometimes grief arrives unbeckoned.
Yes.
You're walking through the supermarket, and right there between the Raisin Bran and the Cheerios, it hits you, and the next thing you know, you're on the floor in a puddle of tears.
Yes.
And that's the way grief is. It's completely unpredictable and uncontrollable. And the best we can do is get familiar with it, get really familiar with it, so that it doesn't have us by the throat.
Yes.
It doesn't mean it's gonna go away. So the everyday grief of our life. I mean, I was with a guy once. His daughter died, and he worked in a meatpacking plant in South Dakota somewhere. And when he arrived on the scene, his daughter had already died, and we had bathed her, and she was in the bed. And it was about 3 a.m, and I said, Clyde, I got to go home. I got to go home with the kids, And he said, okay. He said, I'll stay up with her, talking about his daughter. And I said, all right. And so he stayed there with his daughter, hand on her leg. And when I came back in the morning, other volunteers had stayed with him. There he was, drinking a cup of coffee, making plans to fly his daughter home for a funeral back in South Dakota. And we went outside to the backyard, and I said, Clyde, I can't imagine what this is like to lose your daughter. It's one of our worst fears as a parent. He said, Frank, it's kind of familiar. And at first I didn't know what he was talking about. But what he was talking about was this everyday grief of our life. The smaller losses in our life that all of us endure or tolerate or perhaps integrate in our lives that in a way prepare us. It doesn't mean that we won't cry and that we won't feel loss, but they remind us of what loss is about.
Yes.
And they show us what that feeling state is like and what that state of mind is like and what the state of body is like. That's what he was talking. He was talking about the everyday grief of our life. When our expectations are unmet, we grieve.
Yes.
When relationships don't turn out the way we imagined, we grieve. Yeah. So grief is part of it's our common ground with each other, and it knits us together in a way. And right now in the world, we're experiencing an international phenomenon. And one of the things we're experiencing is our common ground with each other. We're experiencing our commonality of our grief. And if we can join together in that commonality, David, can't we join together in other things as well?
Yes.
I mean, if we're not willing to feel our grief, we're going to cut our hearts off from our joy and our compassion and our happiness.
Yes.
So grief is really even though it initially feels fragmenting, it is actually our common ground with one another.
That's an incredible concept. Grief is our common ground with one another. You use three words, something, and then tolerate or integrate. What was your first? The
Endure.
first endure. That's exactly right. We either endure grief, or tolerate grief, or integrate grief. That's an amazing thought.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes what we're trying to do is keep grief at arm's length. Like we're a football player straight arming the opposing team as we run down the field. And actually, what we need to do is bring it close, bring it really close, get to know it extremely well. And we're having to learn that because in many cases, those families that have multi-generations have learned that experience of grief from their elders.
Yes.
But those of us, in our culture, we've made individuality a kind of God. And it's one of our greatest causes of suffering is the way we cut ourselves off from one another. And one of the things that happens in that process is we lose contact with the rituals and the processes that enabled us to deal with these impossible situations like what we're experiencing now.
Yeah. Wow. All right.
We have 2 hours.
Time goes. Yes. So you're on a plane. You're flying to give a talk, and you pull out a piece of paper, and out of your heart comes this recognition that death extends 5 invitations to us, and we do not have time to develop them really, although I'm hoping that you'll come back and do that for us. But you begin to scratch out the 5 invitations. Tell us what they are.
Okay. I was on my way to actually teach Bill Moyer's crew, his hard-nosed journalist, about how to be with dying, because he was making a film called On Our Own Terms. And I thought, well, what have I learned from dying people? And the first one was, don't wait. Waiting is full of expectation. Waiting for the next moment to arrive, we miss this one. So don't wait to tell someone you love that you love them. That's the first one. Don't wait. Don't wait. Don't wait for some other time to start your life. Don't wait until you find yourself in your own deathbed to know the lessons it has to teach. The second one is welcome everything, push away nothing. Now that doesn't even sound intelligent. Why would we do that? Welcome everything doesn't mean you have to like it or agree with it. It just means it's at your doorstep, so can you meet it? It's like the great African-American writer James Baldwin says, there are a lot of things in this world that we cannot change, but nothing can be changed until it is met. Yeah, until it's accepted. So welcome everything, push away nothing. Yeah, do we know what it is that's going to free up our lives? We don't really know in advance. So that means we got to be willing to meet everything that's there. The third one, if I remember correctly, is bring your whole self to the experience. Bring your whole self to the experience. We usually think that it's our expertise that will help people, for example, or our strength that will help people, and they do. They do help people, but I have found in my work over the years that often it's the parts of me that I'm most embarrassed about, that I'm most ashamed of, in fact, that have been the meeting places with the people I served. So it's not just my strength that helps. My helplessness helps. My grief helps. My fear helps. They serve as meeting places with the people that I might be interacting with. I have a lot of tools that I developed over the years, David, but I have a whole big toolbox full of them. But I don't set that toolbox down between me and a patient. If I do, one of us is sure to trip over it. So I don't lead with my tools. I lead with my humanity. Yeah. The fourth one is find a place of rest in the middle of things. We often think we'll get rest later, like when we go on a holiday or our list gets checked off or our email box is empty. I don't know about you, but my list is never checked off. My email box has never been empty, And when you're taking care of someone you love who's dying, you don't have the time necessarily to go on a holiday or to step away. So you have to find a way of resting right in the middle of what you're doing. And we do that by bringing our attention fully and completely to what we're doing, like you and I were talking about fear and grief before, by bringing our attention, our awareness to what's happening as it's happening. And when we do that, we get more present, we get more in real time. We're not thrown off into the future or lost in the past. We're here and available in this moment. And the final fifth one is cultivate don't know mind. I ran the Zen Hospice, so I felt like I should put something Zen-like in the list. Cultivate don't know mind. It doesn't mean to be ignorant. That's foolish. Ignorance is not knowing. Ignorance is misperception. We misperceive the truth of something, and then we insist on it. There's a lot of that going on in the world right now. That's ignorance. Don't know mind is a mind that's open and curious and full of wonder and awe. You know, it's got fresh eyes. It wants to learn. When we're so filled with our knowing, sometimes there's no room for anything else to enter. So a don't know mind is a ready mind, one that's curious. It wants to discover. Yeah. So those are all practices, qualities that I learned from being with people at the bedside. The last thing I'll say about this is an invitation is simple. I invite you to my house for dinner. Your job is to show up. Right? That's your job. So what these invitations are is an invitation to your life, really. And what your job is to do is to show up. And you can use these invitations as basic principles, guiding lights, if you will, to help you navigate what is sometimes impossible and also what is ordinary in this life. Yeah. Yes. So that's the five. Yes.
One of the things that I say is that if you're willing to hear it, grief or death is the biggest cheerleader for you. It sits off just sort of outside of your perception, and it calls out to you, be alive, be alive. And it cheers us on to be awake, to be aware, to be fully alive in each and every moment, because we have an appointment. Death and life share a common border. We have an appointment, but if it's not today, then let's be fully alive.
I mean, one of the things that's true is that when we get in touch with how precarious this life actually is, and we are really in the throes of that right now. Yes. As a culture, when we see that, when it's visceral for us, then we understand how precious life is. Yes. Then we don't want to waste a moment. Then we want to jump into our life with both feet. We want to live it with integrity and some degree of responsibility, and we want to be of service to the world. Yes. Yeah? For those we love. So don't wait.
Yes. So I always try to close our live by asking our guest about something practical, one small practical thing that they would suggest as people tackle grief work.
Two things I would say. One is, before we find ourselves in the throes of loss, let's study the way we meet endings. You want to know something about the way in which we die? Study the way you meet endings, the end of a sentence, the end of a meal, the end of a day. How do you meet endings? Do you just space them out? Do you just move on without any consciousness around them? Or, what happens if you bring them forward in your life as a learning tool? That's the first thing. Second is, when we're in the middle of grief, it's a visceral experience. It's not enough to talk about it. You got to feel it. You got to feel it physically. If there's someone you love and you can't be with them in their dying process, get a shirt or a piece of clothing that reminds you of them, either because of the sight of it or because of the smell of it, and hold it close to you. It's a physical experience. When I was working in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, I lost 40 or 50 people a week. And I did three things to balance myself. The first was I went to my meditation cushion where I could learn to regulate my emotional experience. That was very important, but it wasn't sufficient. The second thing I did was I went to the maternity ward at the local hospital where I knew the nurses. And there were babies there born to addicted mothers, to crack and alcohol. And I would hold these babies and rock them back and forth in a chair. And as I would soothe them, stroke them, their suffering would be reduced. And I couldn't always do that for the people that I was working with who were dying of AIDS. I couldn't necessarily take away their suffering. But with these babies, I could. That really sustained me. It was life-giving. And the third thing I did is I went for some body work once a week. And I'd go to this body worker, and I'd come in his office, lay down on his table, and he'd say, "Where today, Frank?" And I'd say, "Just here on my shoulder." And he'd put his hand on my shoulder, and he wouldn't massage the rest of my body at all. He'd just keep his hand there. And I would weep for about an hour. And there was something about that physical contact and the relational quality of my trusting him that was essential for me. We didn't talk about it. We didn't process it. And I'd get up off the table, and he'd say, "See you next week." And I said, "Yep, I'll be back next week." So there's something about the physical experience of grief. if we can, find someone to hold you. And if you can't find someone to hold you, put your hand on your own heart and do a practice, which I do every morning now. And I just say to myself, I choose love. I choose love. And it's not woo-woo and it's not California. It's just real. It's a way of kindly caring for myself.
Yes.
And affirming that I choose love. Yeah.
Wow.
Those are very simple practices I would recommend. Yeah.
Wow. One of the sentences in the book that was, I don't even know how to describe it, but you had this one simple sentence where you said, love is not a gated community. And the image of that, just the whole word picture of that was so unbelievable. And when you begin with that, the idea that sometimes we keep ourselves out, we lock ourselves out of the process, not just locking other people out, but yeah, that love is not a gated community.
Nothing. I mean, every part of you gets in, even those parts of you that seem unlovable.
Yes.
They get into.
Yeah, they do. Frank, it's been an amazing experience having this conversation with you. I hope you'll come back and do this with us again. Your gentleness, your wisdom, your kindness, your understanding is so sweet, and I am incredibly thankful for you being here today.
You're very welcome, David. And if people want to get this more materials at 5invitations.com.
Yes.
There they can find videos and articles and other things that might help them right now in these troubling times.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for what you're doing. It's great that you're doing this.
Thank you. Remember that 5invitations.com. Let me see here. Do I have? That's the metainstitute.org is where you can also get some information. And the 5 Invitations book, please go there, 5invitations.com, and you can get that information there as well.